Let me ask you something. What does it mean to be the last? The last king of a dying empire, watching everything your ancestors built crumble around you while you make one desperate deal after another just to survive one more year, one more month, one more day. And what does it mean to be inevitable? To be the conqueror who sees that last flickering light on the map and knows, with absolute certainty, that it's yours for the taking. This is the story of Trebizond, not Constantinople. Everyone knows about Constantinople, the fall of the great Byzantine capital in 1453. But 8 years later, there was another end. Quieter, smaller, but in some ways more final. The last true remnant of the Byzantine Empire, the Empire of Trebizond, as it was called in the West, held out on the southeastern coast of the Black Sea for over 2 centuries after Constantinople fell to the Fourth Crusade in 1204. It survived Mongol invasions, Turkish emirates, civil wars, and plague. It was rich from trade, protected by mountains, and ruled by the Komnenos dynasty, the last bearers of an imperial title stretching back to ancient Rome. And then Mehmed II, the man who took Constantinople, the man they called Fatih, the conqueror, turned his attention east. In 1461, he came for Trebizond, and this time there would be no escape, no reprieve, no miracle rescue. This is how the last Roman Empire died. Before we go any further, here's what I need from you. If this story gives you something you didn't know, if it pulls back the curtain on a piece of history that doesn't get enough attention, hit that like button. Leave a comment about what surprised you or what you'd like to see next. Subscribe if you want more of this detailed, unflinching history without the fluff. That's all I'm asking. Now let's go back to 1461 and watch an empire take its last breath. The Empire of Trebizond. Let's talk about what it actually was. After the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Western European crusaders sacked Constantinople and carved up the Byzantine Empire, several Greek states emerged claiming to be the legitimate continuation of Rome. The Despotate of Epirus in the west, the Empire of Nicaea in northwestern Anatolia, and out on the far edge of the Black Sea, the Empire of Trebizond. Trebizond was founded by Alexios and David Komnenos, grandsons of the Byzantine Emperor Andronikos I. They seized the city of Trebizond and the surrounding coastal region with support from their relative, Queen Tamar of Georgia, one of the most powerful rulers in the region at the time. For over 250 years, the Komnenian dynasty ruled this small state. It never controlled much territory, maybe 200 miles of coastline and some mountain valleys inland, but it was strategically positioned and economically important. Why? Trade. Trebizond was the western terminus of the Silk Road's northern route. Caravans came down from Central Asia through Tabriz in Persia, over the mountains, and reached the Black Sea at Trebizond. From there, goods were shipped across to Constantinople, Crimea, and the Mediterranean. Spices, silk, precious metals, all of it flowed through Trebizond's harbor. The city was rich. Its rulers lived in palaces decorated with imported luxuries. Foreign merchants, Venetians, Genoese, Persians, Armenians, maintained trading posts and fought for commercial privileges. The empire survived by playing larger powers against each other. They paid tribute to the Seljuks when necessary, then to the Mongols after the Ilkhanate conquered Persia in the 13th century. They married their daughters to Muslim rulers, Christian kings, anyone who could offer protection. They maintained a small professional army and relied on mountain fortresses and diplomacy more than military strength. By the mid-15th century, Trebizond was a shadow of what it had been. The Mongol collapse disrupted trade. The rise of the Ottoman Empire created an existential threat. The empire's territory had shrunk. Internal politics were chaotic, full of court intrigues, coups, and dynastic struggles, but it was still independent, still ruled by a Komnenos emperor, still calling itself Roman. The emperor in 1461 was David Komnenos, the last of his line. He came to power in 1459, not through strength, but through circumstance. His brother, John IV, died without an adult heir. David was installed, but he wasn't a strong ruler. He was indecisive, prone to listening to bad advice, and fundamentally out of his depth in the brutal geopolitics of the era. Meanwhile, to the west, Mehmed II was consolidating the greatest Muslim empire since the Abbasid Caliphate. He was 29 years old in 1461. He'd taken Constantinople 8 years earlier when he was just 21. That conquest made him a legend. He rebuilt the city, repopulated it, made it the capital of the Ottoman Empire. He campaigned in the Balkans, crushed Serbian resistance, fought the Hungarians, secured Ottoman control over Greece and much of the southern Balkans. But Mehmed wasn't satisfied. He had a vision of a universal empire. He saw himself as the successor to Rome, to Alexander, to the great conquerors of history. Every independent Christian state in Anatolia was an insult to that vision. And Trebizond, sitting out there on the Black Sea, still calling its ruler Basilius, emperor, was unfinished business. Mehmed had reasons beyond pride. Trebizond's location was strategically valuable. Controlling the southern Black Sea coast would secure Ottoman dominance in the region. It would cut off potential alliances between Christian states and Persia. It would also send a message: there is no remnant of Byzantium that the Sultan cannot reach. In 1460, Mehmed began preparing. He sent envoys to Trebizond demanding submission. David Komnenos, hoping to buy time, sent gifts and vague promises but didn't formally submit. That was a mistake. Mehmed wasn't interested in half measures. You either bent the knee completely or you were an enemy. David made another mistake. He tried to form an alliance. He reached out to Sultan Hassan, the ruler of the Ak-Koyunlu, a Turkic confederation in Persia and eastern Anatolia. Sultan Hassan was one of the few powers in the region strong enough to challenge the Ottomans. David offered a marriage alliance, giving his daughter Theodora to Sultan Hassan. The hope was that this alliance would deter Mehmed, that the threat of a two-front war would make him back off. It didn't work. Sultan Hassan accepted the marriage, but he wasn't ready for war with the Ottomans. He had his own problems, consolidating control over his territories, dealing with rival factions. When the time came, he wouldn't send the help Trebizond needed. David also appealed to Christian powers in the West. He sent letters to the Pope, to the Venetians, to the Genoese, begging for military support. He invoked the shared faith, the duty to defend Christendom, the historical legacy of Rome. The responses were polite but useless. Venice and Genoa had trade agreements with the Ottomans. They weren't going to risk their commercial interests for a minor empire on the edge of the world. The Pope offered prayers. No troops, no ships, no money, just prayers. Trebizond was alone. In early 1461, Mehmed assembled his army. The exact size is debated, but Ottoman sources and later accounts suggest somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 men. Infantry, cavalry, siege engineers, artillery. The Ottomans had the best artillery in the world at that time. They'd used massive bombards to smash the walls of Constantinople. They knew how to take fortified cities. The army marched east from Bursa, the old Ottoman capital in northwestern Anatolia. They moved through regions already under Ottoman control, gathering supplies, reinforcing units. The plan was to approach Trebizond from the west and south, cutting off escape routes and isolating the city. Trebizond's defenses were decent but not exceptional. The city had walls, fortified in places, but nothing like the triple walls of Constantinople. The garrison was small, maybe a few thousand professional soldiers, plus whatever militia could be raised from the population. The surrounding mountains provided some natural defense, but they also isolated the city. There was no relief force coming overland. The only hope was by sea. David knew the situation was desperate. He tried last-minute diplomacy, sending envoys to Mehmed's camp offering tribute, recognition of Ottoman suzerainty, anything short of complete surrender. Mehmed's response was clear: unconditional surrender or destruction. He would accept nothing less than the keys to the city and the abdication of the emperor. The Ottoman army arrived outside Trebizond in late June or early July 1461. They set up camp, surrounding the landward side of the city. Ottoman ships blockaded the harbor. Supplies were cut off. The city was under siege. But here's the thing, this wasn't going to be a long siege. Mehmed didn't have the patience for it, and he didn't need it. His artillery could breach the walls. His army could storm the city. A long siege was expensive and tied down his forces. He wanted this over quickly. The bombardment began. Ottoman cannons fired stone and iron balls at the walls. The noise was constant, terrifying. Sections of the wall began to crack. Defenders tried to repair the damage at night, piling rubble and timber, but it was a losing battle. Each day the walls weakened. Each day the certainty of the outcome became clearer. Inside the city, panic set in. The population knew what happened to cities that resisted the Ottomans. If they held out and the walls were breached, the soldiers would be given permission to sack the city. Rape, murder, enslavement, that was the standard practice. Resist and pay the price, or surrender and maybe be treated with some mercy. David's advisors were split. Some argued for continued resistance, hoping Sultan Hassan would send an army, hoping the Genoese or Venetians would change their minds, hoping for a miracle. Others argued for immediate surrender. Delay was only going to make things worse. If they surrendered now, while the walls still stood, Mehmed might be merciful. If they waited until the walls fell, there would be no mercy. David hesitated. He didn't want to be the emperor who gave up without a fight. The weight of history, the legacy of the Komnenos dynasty, the pride of calling himself Roman, it paralyzed him, but the reality was inescapable. There was no rescue coming. The walls were failing. His people were terrified. He had no options left. Negotiations began in earnest. David sent representatives to Mehmed's camp. They offered formal submission. David would abdicate. The city would open its gates. The population would accept Ottoman rule. In return, they asked for clemency. No sack, no massacre, no mass enslavement. Safe passage for David and his family. Guarantees for the lives and property of the citizens. Mehmed, for his part, was willing to be magnanimous. He'd gotten what he wanted without a costly assault. A peaceful surrender was preferable. It saved lives among his own soldiers, preserved the city's infrastructure and wealth, and set a precedent. Other cities and states would see that surrendering to Mehmed didn't mean destruction. It meant integration into the Ottoman system. The terms were agreed upon. David Komnenos would formally surrender the city. He would abdicate his title and recognize Mehmed as his sovereign. In exchange, David and his family would be given estates in the Ottoman interior and allowed to live in relative comfort. The citizens of Trebizond would not be enslaved. Their property would be protected. The churches would remain, though some would be converted to mosques. Greek Christians would live as dhimmis, protected but subordinate, paying special taxes but allowed to practice their religion. On August 15, 1461, the feast of the Dormition of the Virgin Mary in the Orthodox calendar, David Komnenos rode out of Trebizond to Mehmed's camp. He was dressed in imperial regalia, one last display of the dignity he was about to surrender. He dismounted, approached the Sultan, and formally submitted. He handed over the keys to the city. He removed his crown. The ceremony was brief, almost anticlimactic. Mehmed entered Trebizond the next day. Ottoman soldiers marched through the gates. Banners were raised. The city was now part of the Ottoman Empire. The last independent successor state of Byzantium was extinguished. The immediate aftermath was relatively peaceful, at least compared to what could have happened. There was no sack, no mass killings. The terms of surrender were honored, mostly. Some churches were converted to mosques, including the famous Panagia Chrysophilos, the Church of the Golden-Headed Virgin, which became the Fatih Mosque. Ottoman administrators took over governance. The Greek population, now subjects of the Sultan, adjusted to the new reality. David and his family were escorted to the interior. They were given an estate near Adrianople, modern-day Edirne, in Thrace. For a while, it seemed like David would live out his life in comfortable obscurity, a pensioner of the Sultan, the last emperor of a dead empire. But that's not how it ended. David made one final, fatal mistake. In exile, he started plotting. He made contact with Sultan Hassan again. He sent letters to Italian states. He tried to organize a conspiracy to restore his rule, to spark a rebellion in Trebizond, to get Western support for a crusade against the Ottomans. It was delusional. David had no power, no army, no realistic chance of success. But he tried anyway, and Mehmed found out. In 1463, just 2 years after the fall of Trebizond, David Komnenos and his sons were arrested. The charges were treason and conspiracy. There was no trial in any real sense. Mehmed ordered their execution. On November 1, 1463, David and 7 of his sons, along with his nephew, were beheaded in Adrianople. Some accounts say they were executed in the marketplace. Others say in a prison. The details vary, but the outcome is the same. The male line of the Komnenos dynasty, the bloodline that claimed descent from Roman emperors going back centuries, was wiped out in a single day. David's daughter Theodora, married to Sultan Hassan, survived. His other daughters were absorbed into Ottoman society, married off, or placed in harems. The family ceased to exist as a political entity, and Trebizond, the city, continued as an Ottoman provincial center. Its Greek population persisted for centuries, maintaining their language, their religion, their identity under Ottoman rule. The city remained economically important, though trade routes shifted over time. It wasn't destroyed, just transformed. For the Ottomans, the conquest of Trebizond was a footnote. Mehmed went on to campaign in the Balkans, fight wars in Anatolia, attempt to take Italy. He ruled for another 20 years, constantly expanding, constantly consolidating. Trebizond was just one more city, one more conquest in a reign full of them. But symbolically, it was enormous. Trebizond was the last. After 1461, there was no Byzantine Empire in any form, no Greek state calling itself Rome, no emperor claiming the legacy of Constantine. The Ottomans were the uncontested masters of Anatolia and the Balkans. The medieval world was ending. The early modern world was beginning. So let's step back and ask the question, how did this happen? How did an empire that lasted over 250 years, that survived Mongols and Turks and plagues and civil wars, finally fall? First, size and isolation. Trebizond was tiny. At its height, it controlled maybe 10,000 square miles of territory. Compare that to the Ottoman Empire, which by 1461 covered hundreds of thousands of square miles across 3 continents. Trebizond couldn't field a large army. It couldn't sustain a long war. It was geographically isolated, surrounded by mountains and sea, which protected it for a while, but also meant it couldn't expand or easily get help. Second, the decline of trade. Trebizond's wealth came from the Silk Road. In the 14th and 15th centuries, that trade declined. The Mongol Ilkhanate collapsed, which disrupted the routes. Maritime trade routes around Africa and later directly across the Indian Ocean started to develop, bypassing the land routes through Central Asia and Anatolia. Trebizond was getting poorer, less able to pay for mercenaries or fortifications. Third, the rise of the Ottomans. Mehmed II inherited a powerful, centralized state with a professional army, advanced artillery, and an efficient bureaucracy. The Ottomans could mobilize resources on a scale Trebizond couldn't imagine. When Mehmed decided to take Trebizond, it wasn't a question of if, but when. Fourth, failed alliances. David tried to get help and couldn't. Sultan Hassan was sympathetic, but unwilling to commit to war. The Christian West didn't care enough. Venice and Genoa valued trade with the Ottomans more than a distant Christian empire. The papacy was busy with internal European politics. Trebizond had no allies willing to fight for it. Fifth, leadership. David Komnenos was not the man for the moment. He was indecisive, easily influenced, and ultimately unable to inspire or organize effective resistance. Maybe no leader could have saved Trebizond at that point, but a stronger, more charismatic emperor might have bought more time, negotiated better terms, or at least gone down fighting in a way that would have been remembered differently. Sixth, the terms of survival. Trebizond survived as long as it did by being non-threatening, by paying tribute, by playing powers against each other. But once Mehmed decided he wanted the city, those tactics stopped working. You can't negotiate with someone who sees your continued existence as an insult. Mehmed didn't want tribute or symbolic submission. He wanted complete control. And finally, inevitability. By 1461, the idea of a Greek Christian empire in Anatolia was an anachronism. The world had moved on. The Byzantine Empire's collapse wasn't a single event in 1453. It was a centuries-long process of decline, fragmentation, and absorption. Trebizond was the last piece to fall, but it was always going to fall. The only question was how and when, but here's what often gets forgotten in this story: the people. The soldiers who defended the walls knowing they couldn't win, the merchants who saw their livelihoods disappear, the families who watched foreign soldiers march through their streets, the priests who prayed in churches that were being turned into mosques. History focuses on emperors and sultans, on dates and battles, but thousands of ordinary people lived through this. Their world ended, not metaphorically, but literally. Everything they knew changed overnight, and they adapted. That's the part that doesn't get told enough. The Greek population of Trebizond didn't vanish. They became Ottoman subjects. They paid their taxes, they followed the new laws, they maintained their communities. Over the next few centuries, some converted to Islam voluntarily or under pressure. Others stayed Christian. They intermarried with Turkish populations. Identities blurred. The city became majority Muslim over time, but the Greek presence persisted until the 20th century, until the population exchanges and genocides of World War I and its aftermath finally erased what the conquest of 1461 had begun. Mehmed himself didn't live to see the full transformation of Trebizond. He died in 1481 at the age of 49, possibly poisoned, though the circumstances are disputed. He left behind an empire that dominated the eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans, and Anatolia. His successors would expand it further, reach the gates of Vienna, control North Africa, become one of the most powerful states in the world for centuries. Trabzon became a provincial city, important but not central. It had moments of significance during wars with Persia as a base for Ottoman campaigns in the Caucasus, but it was never again the capital of an empire, and the Komnenos dynasty, gone, David's execution ended the line. There were scattered descendants through his daughters, but none who could claim the imperial title. The family that had ruled for over 250 years vanished in a single afternoon. There's a certain historical irony here. The Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, survived for over 1,000 years after the fall of Rome in the West. It endured barbarian invasions, Arab conquests, crusades, internal strife, and came back from the brink repeatedly. But in the end, it died quietly. Not in a grand final battle, but in a negotiated surrender in a small city on the Black Sea that most people in the West had never heard of. Constantinople's fall in 1453 gets all the attention. It was dramatic, the walls breached after a brutal siege, the last emperor dying in the fighting, the great city taken by storm. That's the story people remember, but Trebizond's fall might be more representative of how empires actually die. Not in a blaze of glory, but in a slow decline, a series of compromises, a final surrender when there are no options left. David Komnenos didn't die fighting on the walls. He didn't lead a heroic last stand. He negotiated, he abdicated, he tried to survive, and then he made a stupid mistake that got him and his sons killed. That's messier, less heroic, but probably more honest about how these things happen, and maybe that's the lesson. Empires don't die because of one battle, one decision, one moment. They die because the circumstances that allowed them to exist change, trade routes shift, larger powers rise, allies disappear, internal cohesion weakens. And eventually, there's a moment when survival is no longer possible, when the best you can hope for is a relatively painless end. Trebizond held out longer than anyone expected. It outlived the Latin Empire, it outlived the other Byzantine successor states, it outlived the Mongol Ilkhanate, it even outlived Constantinople itself, as an independent Greek city, but in the end, it couldn't outlive the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power. The last remnant of Rome fell on August 15, 1461, not to a barbarian horde, but to a sophisticated, organized, militarily superior empire that saw itself as the legitimate heir to Rome's legacy. And in a way, maybe it was. The Ottomans controlled the former Roman heartlands. They ruled from Constantinople. Mehmed called himself Caesar Caesar of Rome. The transition of power was complete. For nearly 500 years after that, the Ottomans would rule the lands that had once been Byzantine. Empires that lasted 1,000 years were replaced by empires that lasted 500. And those, in turn, collapsed in the 20th century, replaced by nation-states that are still figuring out their identities. History doesn't end, it transforms. Trebizond today is Trabzon, a city in northeastern Turkey. It's a port, a commercial center, a place where tourists visit Byzantine ruins and Ottoman mosques. The empire is gone, the emperors are forgotten by most, but the city remains. If this story taught you something, if it made you think about how empires end, about the people caught in those endings, about the messy reality of history versus the clean narratives we tell, then do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who cares about history. Comment below with what struck you most or what you want to hear about next. Subscribe if you want more of this, history that doesn't shy away from the complexity, the tragedy, the uncomfortable truths. There are more stories like this. More forgotten endings, more last stands, more moments when the world changed and nobody quite realized it at the time. We're going to keep digging into them, keep finding the details that textbooks leave out, keep telling the stories that deserve to be remembered. History isn't just about the winners. It's about the losers too, the empires that fell, the people who survived, the compromises that were made, the roads not taken. Trebizond is one of those stories, small, distant, overshadowed by bigger events, but it mattered to the people who lived it. And understanding how and why it ended tells us something about how power works, how empires rise and fall, and how the world we live in now was shaped by decisions made centuries ago. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.